The impetus of the book was this idea that as African Americans begin to increase their socioeconomic status, and I'll have a couple of slides on um, the actual increases that they've made, they've now moved into different types of networks. Okay. And so when they're in different types of networks, the question is, how does that affect their political behavior? Okay. So who do you hang with? So I have a little brother. I love him to death. We have similar ideologies. We both come from the same lineage. We like different, similar things. But for some reason, he likes Duke. Okay. And I like North Carolina. So, as much as I love him a little less because he likes Duke. So, looking at Atlanta, right? You got Julio Jones and you got Drew Brees, right? So, what happens when you are the biggest Falcons fan that's out there? And you go to work and you have Falcon stickers on your car and you have season tickets to the football games and license plate, you got a Falcons cake for your birthday, everything else. And then the guy that sits next to you at work shows up and he puts his Saints flag on the desk, right? So you may have a lot in common with him. He may help you out as far as accomplishing your work tasks and things like that. But when it comes to football, you like him a little less, okay? So now the question becomes, what happens when the Saints play the Falcons? What do you do? Do you watch the game a little harder? Do you come in and talk a little more noise on that Friday before the game or that Monday if you're actually victorious? Do you decide to wear your Falcons gear before the game, right? Because you are in that particular network, it has changed your behavior. Okay? And so maybe if you were surrounded by nothing but Falcons fans, if you're surrounded by nothing but Falcons fans, you would act a little differently than when you're actually around people who are not of the same persuasion as are you. Okay. So, one of the main reasons why I wanted to study this was a book by a scholar, William Julius Wilson, in 1978. It's called The Declining Significance of Race. And so what Wilson is writing in an interesting time, a time that we are still seeing keep going as far as these rises in socioeconomic status. So what happens after the civil rights movement in 1964 is that all of the explicit de jure barriers to segregation are removed. So now African Americans can go to predominantly white schools. Some African Americans can work with other white people on the factory floor or something like that in the workplace and things like that. And so Wilson's hypothesis was one of a pessimism that as these African Americans, so you have to remember, right? The segregated community is encapsulated within itself. And so the doctor is in the community as the Black doctor, and the school is in the Black community as the Black school, and the Black church is in the Black community, and the preacher is the lawyer, is the leader. So everyone relies on one another in order to actually survive in a situation that is suboptimal, to say the least. So then Wilson comes in and he says, well, what's going to happen when those Blacks don't have to help other Blacks anymore because they can go to the Emorys of the world, because they can find different workplaces that aren't necessarily in these segregated areas? And so his worry was that once race begins to decline in significance and class begins to increase in significance, wealthier Black folks won't want to help out the less fortunate Black people who were not able to get those education gains, who were not able to move into that suburban neighborhood and things like that. He actually writes another book. It's called the Permanently Disadvantaged, where he's the Truly Disadvantaged, where he's worried that what's going to happen is that there's going to be this Black underclass of people who have basically been left behind from those gangs. And because of that underclass and African Americans not really needing to help them, they won't help them politically, right? Basically, if you think about it as an example, they will start voting their class and not their race once they're able to get into these places where race doesn't matter as much. And so that's basically what my starting point was, because frankly, it did not gel with the experiences that I was seeing, right? What I was seeing, and full disclosure, I have always gone to majority white schools, majority white elementary, middle school, high school, college, and things like that. And so, particularly in college at the University of Texas at Austin, I went undergrad there and grad school there. Particularly in college, us being in this kind of situation where we were surrounded by so much whiteness, if you will, really made me wonder, why didn't some people actually move into that white area, right? Why didn't some people end up joining that white sorority and things like that? And so I set out to figure out why. And so my book in 2017 is the first quantitative study of African American suburbanites. So previously, a lot of the literature, and I won't bore you with a whole bunch of literatures, they're all in the book. If you have any questions about any of them, then definitely, if you have any questions about any of them, then definitely ask me, okay? And I must say, I am a teacher, okay? So if you have a question, if something that comes up is unclear, it's not because it's unclear to you, it's because I'm not explaining it right. So if you have a question that I'm probably not explaining right, please raise your hand and we can go from there. And so basically what I sat down to do, I'm a quantitative researcher by training, is to see, do these African Americans that are in these particular networks, these majority white networks or these suburban neighborhoods, do they hold racial opinion that is more radical than the whites that they are around? Or by being out there, have they kind of, has their ideology converged, particularly their ideology on racial issues, right? Because we can see, all right, yes, maybe we're all Democrats, but as we're seeing right now, not all Democrats treat race the same way. And so we may all have similar incomes, right? But as we are seeing now, not all people with high incomes want to redistribute it to certain areas and certain types of people. And so I really set out to see if this was the case. How does this work? So the research shows, and this is Huckfeld and Sprague and all these other people, the research shows that the people you hang around with, we'll just call it your social network from now on, the people you hang with actually influence your political behavior. Now, it's always interesting. When I first started really researching this, like there was literally like no TikTok, no Snapchat. There was a Facebook. There was a little bit of a Twitter, but not this crazy Twitter now, right? And so think about the people that you actually physically hang with as a type of network, but also think about the people you interact with daily online, if you have a group chat, stuff like that, okay? So the first thing that we see is that the people you hang with influence your political behavior most generally because they are like you, right? You hang out with people that you like. If you dislike the person, you wouldn't hang out with them. If the people share a common culture, a common set of beliefs and interests and things like that, then you may be more trusting of them when they give you political information. So we'll just make this up off the fly. Actually, it's not really made up. I have a friend, poor guy, loved Andrew Yang. I mean, bought the first version of the Andrew Yang t-shirts, donated money to his campaign, just Yang, Yang, Yang. And so he would always come into our group chat with Yang stuff, with Yang articles, posting Yang information and stuff like that. And so because we're both in the same fraternity and we both went to the same school and we're both of relatively similar ages, because we shared that kinship, I was more likely to actually read the Yang article than I would if I was around people that I didn't trust or or that I didn't like. Okay, so that's the first thing where we say it's going to influence my political behavior. I know more about UBI than you ever want to, only because of this guy's post. The other thing that structures our political behavior is who are you around the most, right? Who are you around most often? Because if you're around them the most often, then you have more of an opportunity in order to share political information, okay? And this is where we're going to get into the whole proximate versus self-selecting networks. It's interesting. Okay, I have time. I'm coming to Atlanta, and um, I'm looking for a seat on the plane. Or no, no, no. The guy says, if you want to check your bag, come up here and check your carry-on bag. So I say, sure. He's like, the plane, we don't have room, da, 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 black guy. So I'm like, sure. I go up to him. I say, I want to check my bag. He says, oh, thanks, man. Thanks, man. I really needed that. I helped you out. And then he looks at my ticket. And he's like, oh, you have an aisle seat. He's like, let me put you in the comfort row you have a middle seat. Let me put you in the comfort row on an aisle seat. So I'm like, yeah, man, do me a solid, right? And so then I go and I find my seat and I sit down. And there's this African American lady of similar age to me. And so she says, when I sit down, she says, how you doing? I say, oh, Lord. I say, I'm doing great. Nice to meet you. I'm Ernest. And she's like, oh, I'm Regina. And so I have this person that spells her name, Regina, in a different type of way. So I just asked the lady, well, how do you spell Regina? And she goes ahead and spells it the same way. And I'm like, fine, put on my headphones, stuff like that, right? Not realizing that we were now kindreds, okay? And so I look down, and her Louis Vuitton Neverfull is on my side of the aisle, seat, like literally under my seat, right? Now, a Neverfull is like this huge bag that you can put all this stuff in. Okay, so now the question becomes, is she just a rude person? Or did she feel that comfort with me because she perceived that we would be similar culturally and ideologically? All right. Now we talk about rising socioeconomic status. From the 1990s to 2010, the African American high school graduation rate went from 66% to 84%. That is a very large jump. The median income gain was about $4,706. For African Americans, if you look at it in a 5-year period, African Americans outgained whites and Latinos in graduation rates by percentage. Of course, whites was already really high in that time. They're also, because of their increased educational attainment, they're also finding themselves in more prestigious occupations. So the PhD, right? The first generation PhD, the lawyer, the doctor, things like that, right? We also see that suburban versus urban neighborhood types are also very different, where the suburban type, it has a higher overall level of median income, as one might expect, and a higher home value, okay? So there are two things that are happening here. African Americans, by their socioeconomic gains, are able to now get into these majority white occupations and majority white neighborhoods, okay? And then the question is, okay, are they going to now look more similar as the people that they're around or not? Spoiler alert, they don't. All right, so generally two types of networks that we talk about. The thing about social networks that make them so great is that social networks function as information cost cutters, okay? So there is, the New York Times comes out every single day, right? You may have a subscription to the New York Times, and you're going to go through and you're going to read it, and you're going to get some article on page B3 that says something about the politics that are happening, right? That's costly. It's costly to get the paper. It's costly to take your time to read the paper, stuff like that. But when that New York Times article comes up in your Facebook feed and you read it, you've cut the cost, okay? And so that's what networks do. And when we're talking about physical networks, we generally think about a term we call opinion leaders. And some of you guys in this room are probably the opinion leaders for your group. Those things cut costs, right? My friends never watch the State of the Union address. They just call me and say, what was it about? Or did Trump do good? So like that, right? Because I am cutting the cost for their information. The thing that allows my cost cutting to be impactful is that they trust me. Okay. All right. Two types of networks. We have proximate networks, those that you are in most often, usually not necessarily chosen. Okay. And then we have self-selecting networks, ideologically congruent on some type of issue where there is something that makes you together with these people. You choose to be them. You are of the same religion. You are of the same fraternal organization. You are of the same type of interest. Okay. The interesting thing about for African Americans is that their proximate networks, the ones that they are around the most, are the ones that are also the least racially reinforcing. Okay. The ones where their racial identity is not able to actually be put forth. It's interesting, we were talking about this. So a couple of years ago, we bought a house. And we bought a house and we're looking around the neighborhood, really, really nice house. Saw the neighbors, everything else. And then we buy the house, we get in the house, and I'm walking in my backyard one time. I look over to my neighbor's backyard, big, pretty red Confederate flag, just right there. I mean, huge Confederate flag out there. And so, and then some kind of way he invited me to, he's a cool guy. He has a key to my house. He is, he comes every time my grandmother's around, but the Lord eventually got to that Confederate flag because we had a bad storm and it started ripping it up, and then it just fell down. But anyway, so the point is, though, do I go and talk to this guy about Barack Obama or Michael Brown or something like that, right? When I can kind of tell he may not be as conducive to it. Okay. When I got my job, I did not get to pick my office, right? People don't necessarily get to pick who their cubicle mates are. People don't necessarily get to pick who they go to lunch with and things like that. So you're around these people most often, but due to rising socioeconomic status, these places may not be racially reinforcing. Okay, so yeah, so that's the proximate network. And then we look at the cycling network, these places like this, where you are ideologically congruent on some issue, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are congruent on everything, right? The cycle team is together because they all like bicycles. And so if we're going to look for a policy that is maybe whether or not we should spend taxes on more bike lanes, okay? Well, I know my cycle club is ready, right? We're gonna go protest down more bike lanes, more bike lanes, more bike lanes. But then let's say what happens when that first officer involved shooting of an unarmed black man happens. And I'm at the cycling club when it comes up, all right? You know that adage, don't ever talk politics and religion and things like that. That is the question, right? So if I'm around my office mates, right? If I'm around my cubicle mates, and we want to talk about, whether or not LeBron did well, or did you watch the last episode of Game of Thrones, then that is going to help me in my Game of Thrones-ness, right? Because when that person actually reads all the fiction and the backstories and things like that, and then gives it to me, I'm better at Game of Thrones, okay? And so I know I can come to him or her for Game of Thrones stuff. Probably not the same case when it comes to race and different ideas politically. All right, now, there is an interesting literature. This is this guy, Scott McClurg. There's an interesting literature on minority network status. Are you in the minority of your network? Okay, so think about if all of your friends are Democrats and you happen to be a Republican. Think about if all of your friends love basketball and you love baseball, right? So there's a question as to what happens in this minority status, okay? Now, an interesting aspect of this minority status is that, number one, a network has certain norms, norms, okay? There are all norms of behavior in any network whatsoever, okay? So just like your workplace may have a norm of what kind of clothes you wear or what days you get to wear certain clothes, just like in our group chat, right? There are things that are just out of bounds, right? Things that we just do not say, even if it's a joke, even if you don't mean it, even if you only mean it tongue in cheek. We have established those norms. So if you want to be a part of our network, then you need to be on those norms as well. Okay. All right. Now, what we see is that, okay, so when you and I have a conversation, a one on one conversation, that is an interaction between the two of us called a dyad, two of us in a dyad. And I'm quickly trying to figure out whether you're in my network or not. Do you agree with me on whatever issue I'm saying, right? All conversation is trying to convince someone of a particular point of view. And so what we see is that oftentimes majority members misperceive the levels of agreement in their networks. All right, we're walking through this. Misperceive agreement in their networks. So when the guy comes up to me and says Michael Brown shouldn't have been stealing whatever he was stealing, right? Or when he comes up to me and says, oh man, they sure are treating police badly and stuff like that. If I've never talked to him, particularly if we're just in a cycling club or we just have an office next to one another, he or she may be more likely to think that I'm in agreement with whatever they're saying and then be okay with doing it. You always, I tell my students all the time, everybody that laughs at your racist joke isn't also a racist, right? And so when you see these folks leak out their Snapchat messages of people or leak out the blackface that people sent them and they're so outrageous, well, what's happening? That person got that blackface, said, I don't like that you're doing this, and leaked it out. Now, if the person that was doing the blackface knew it was going to leak out, they wouldn't have sent it to that person. They would have sent it to everyone else. And so that's what I mean by the misperception of agreement. Okay. All right. So what does that now mean? Well, now I have a decision to make when he comes up to me and asks me about Michael Brown. I have a decision to make when he comes up to me and asks me about Donald Trump. Okay. I can either engage that person or I can retreat from it and just kind of deflect it or say, oh, I don't talk about politics or I don't do that kind of stuff. Or I could come in and say, no, you're wrong. Michael Bloomberg is better than Andrew Yang. Or no, you're wrong. Barack Obama was actually a good president for African Americans, okay? And so there's a question as to whether or not there is conclusive data on whether people do that engagement or whether they retreat, particularly when it comes to political participation, okay? So that's where we are in the puzzle, all right? We know by structure and by circumstance that these people are now in a position, in an area where their racial identity may not be reinforced and where it's at the minority of the entire social network. And so now the question then becomes, how do they end up behaving off of that? It's interesting. There's a concept called homophily, HOMOFHILLY. And it's this idea that we all form certain bonds together in an in-group and we exclude people that are in the out-group. This is also what we call social identity theory, all right? And so what the research has found, so you think men want to hang out with men, women want to hang out with women, things like that. What we have found is that the number one binding source of in-group or out-group distinctions is race, okay? So when I come up to my workplace, even if I'm in the cycling group, me knowing that race has been one of the main things with which we include and exclude people, I'm already on guard. I'm already worried about what is going to happen. Now, some of the data says that what will happen is when you have that minority status, it increases participation in that you seek out more information about where your minority status is. Others find that no, actually, those people who are minority status are actually depressed in participation. The original work on this idea of minority status has always been um, Catholics in Protestant parishes, or vice versa, or Democrats in Republican neighborhoods, or vice versa. It's never been looked at with race. Okay? Now, what makes race different? Well, race is different because, first off, it's phenotypic. Okay, I can see it. I can see it from the beginning. And so I can already stereotype you, what your opinion is, what you're thinking about, just by looking at you. I can't do that with a Democrat. I can't do that with a Catholic person or stuff like that. Right? And so that's where we're moving on. That's where we're adding to the literature to try to see if racial identity actually works in a different way than those other things. Okay? All right. So so every day I get up and I go to my majority white workplace around these people who are cool enough, but I don't know if I'd ever invite them to my house or anything like that, right? And then I go back to my house next to my Confederate neighbor and all these other people around, right? So now I'm like, when do I get to reinforce my racial identity? When do I get to reinforce my blackness, if you will? And you can use this for gender, right? You can use this for perceived interests, like if you like soccer and no one else actually watches soccer, stuff like that. You can use that for all these things. So, where do I actually go to what we call the Black public sphere or the Black counter public sphere? There's a really good edited volume done by, it's called the Black Public Sphere Consortium. Michael Dawson wrote, well, I think he was one of the head people doing it. Um, that basically talks about counterpublics, okay? And so what happens is a counterpublic is a small community, a small group within a larger group. Okay. Now we know for African Americans, of course, following emancipation, that they were forced into certain neighborhoods, and they were forced into certain neighborhoods where they did not have access to other like banks, and they didn't have access to churches and things like that. And so, because the Black church, because these Black petition organizations, like, I mean, just look at the name, the National Association of Colored People, right? Because of these places, there is, how do I put this? Because of the origins of how the places go, they're really strong on maintaining a racial identity and passing it on to people of other generations. Okay, that is something unique to these Black organizations. Not saying other organizations don't have it, but when we start looking at things like group consciousness and stuff like that, we can see it happen. What also happens in the Black public sphere is that there are racial norms of opinion, right, that you can get to. So this is the classic idea of the barbershop, right? You go to the barbershop, you go to the beauty shop, you get to hear what's going on a certain day, things like that. Not only does it give you information, but it gives you a signal as to the baseline of norms that are happening. So when I'm in the barbershop in 2016 and everyone is like Hillary Clinton is not good, Hillary Clinton is crap, it's like, uh-oh, this is not looking good for her, right? Because we know these places. Now, this is a bit overly simplistic, but think about that historic Black neighborhood wherever you're from. Apparently, Atlanta has a bunch of them. But think about that historic Black neighborhood, possibly where the housing projects are located, and then therefore where the oldest Black church is located, and then where the soul food restaurant is located, right? So I am in my white job the whole time. I am in my white neighborhood the whole time. So then the question becomes, do I actually go out to these places? And then do I use that place as an area for political participation? All right, quickly, the hypotheses and data, you don't have to worry too much about this. African Americans and majority white social networks will hold more racially radical views. I view racially radical, and I don't go too much into this, but we ask a battery of questions. Do you think that discrimination is a big problem in America? Do you think the races will ever be will ever be together? Do you think blacks complain too much? Do you think they should have affirmative action? Should black people form their own party, political party, and stuff like that? So that's what I'm calling racially radical. In the book, we go through all the different ideologies in African American political thought, but I did not have time for all that here. Second, suburban African Americans will view their proximate networks as less racially reinforcing, not really a stretch there. And then the Black public sphere will serve as a social and participatory draw for suburban African Americans, right? They will consciously view that area as somewhere to go to reinforce their racial identity. And lastly, for the political part, suburban African Americans will have an unfavorable view of their local environment and engage in more group-based participation. So really quick, the suburban African American who is in a majority white, probably a majority Republican district, even if they're the most staunch Democrat, almost by definition, that Democrat is going to be more conservative on racial issues than would a Democrat that had a fully racial minority constituency. It's just kind of how it happens, okay? So now it's like, okay, am I casting my vote for this person in this election, right? Even though they're a Democrat, so we have a kinship on that angle, what are we going to see for other things, all right? The data sets, it worked with 3 data sets. This is one of the main problems with my method, is that no one data set actually encompassed everything. So the first data set looked at the racial makeup of your network and workplace, but didn't ask about suburban residents. The second data set is actually an original data set that I did, but it does not, it was done for congressional races, and so there are not a lot of black people. Like out of 2,000 people, I think there are like 150 black people, something outrageous. And then the American National Election Study, which is one of our most extensive studies, is actually, they ask about suburban residents, but suburban residents is actually reported by the interviewer, not necessarily by the interviewee or any kind of geographics, okay? So really quickly onto the data. What we see is that, as one might expect, if you're, black in the white neighborhood, white in the white neighborhood. Now, I ran all of this stuff. It's in all of the appendices for blacks in white neighborhoods versus blacks in black neighborhoods. There's never a statistical difference. Only a couple of times is there actually a statistical difference. And so, as you may expect, they have a lot less trust in institutions based on neighborhood. The same situation happens when we see them in the workplace. So it becomes clear that these people in these majority white areas are very different than their white counterparts, their white workers and neighbors. If we look at behavior, this is one of the few behavioral questions that were actually in. This is from the 2004 National Politics Study, right? Will you donate money to a candidate, right? Blacks in white neighborhoods are more likely to say yes. Will you campaign for a minority candidate? Blacks in white neighborhoods more likely to say yes. So what are they saying? Who do you think they're donating to? Right? So if I'm in an area where the white Democrat doesn't speak to me, that's heavily white, right? Why not use my money? Because I have the money now. I have a PhD. I have above average status. Why not use my money to give to the mayoral candidate in Chicago somewhere, right? Or go and support someone that's running for office in California, right? Because that's my participation. That's where I'm getting my participation out. Same thing with whether or not you campaign for a minority candidate or prefer same race leaders as far as the workplace goes. All right. We also see that there are different norms that people get from church. This is church-based participation. Remember, we talked about how these institutions set the proper norms of behavior. Blacks in white neighborhoods more likely to have heard politics in their churches, sermons on jobs, sermons on the police, things like that. And we see that the same situation holds for workplaces. Interesting thing about black churches is that the clergy person is much more likely to say you need to go out and vote. than in white churches because of that kind of institutional history. All right? If we look at the suburbs, this question and the hypothesis of whether or not they feel closer to the people in their proximate networks or their self-selecting networks, as we see, gratefully, suburban blacks are less likely to feel like the question is, are your views in line with people in your blank, okay? And so, yes or no. And so we can see that suburban blacks, less likely in their proximate networks, much more likely in their church, volunteer organization. We can talk about that in a second, but it's not crazy that that would be the result, right? Because everyone loves their volunteer organization. Why would you be in a volunteer organization that didn't actually agree with what your views are? If we go to community usage, this is where my data gets a little shaky. So this is a question of, do you go to your co-ethnic community to shop, for business, or to eat? Okay, and so it's 1 to 3 scale, a 0 to 3 scale. We see suburban blacks are actually less likely to use that community than are suburban whites or urban blacks. Of course, urban blacks are probably in that community, but still, okay. But once we break it down by whether or not you go to a black church, so whether or not you actually get these norms, now we're seeing what we should think to see. That once you go in to get these norms, you see the community index number is, you see the community index number is higher, more likely to go to travel, business, education, and things like that, right? So we're seeing how what you're getting in your proximate networks is actually then funneling how you act. I'm sorry, what you get in your self-selecting networks, the norms you get, is affecting your behavior. All right. We also see this interesting split in people that have what we call high group consciousness. Group consciousness is a concept that basically says people. How people see people of my race, they also see me in society. I know I put that in artfully, but basically this idea that how society views people of your primary demographic, that is how I think that they view me as well, right? That's why you see a lot of the Muslim people when they're like, oh no, whenever a terrorist event happens, now everyone's gonna look at me like that. That's what we would call group consciousness. And so we can see that those of low group consciousness, these are all suburbanites, those of low group consciousness are less racially radical than those suburbanites of high group consciousness. So we're seeing this interaction. Not only is suburban residents making your proximate networks like that, it also appears to be heightening your level of racial identity and how you then want to actually help out other people. All right. If we look actually politically, this is in the 2008 national election study. Suburban blacks are less likely than suburban whites and urban blacks to have an interest, to express an interest in politics or to read the newspaper, right? Again, think about the political environment that you're in. But once we break it up by your racial identity, again, what we would expect actually goes and holds. And so African Americans with a high racial identity are more likely than other people, suburban African Americans with a low racial identity and urban African Americans, to engage in a lot of these issues. Right? This is the most interesting slide, and then I'm done. All right, this is one of the most interesting slides, okay? And so the question is, trying to get at this idea of your political environment and how does it shape your behavior, okay? And so I can't just look at voting, right? Because voting for the president is for everybody. Right? But what about a house race? What about your House of Representative race in your neighborhood, right? When you go in and you vote for president, to vote in your house race takes absolutely no effort whatsoever. It's just checking another box. It's just scrolling the wheel one time and pressing a button. But what we see is that these African Americans with high group consciousness actually vote for president and then drop off the ballot, right? So clearly they're showing that they're not being engaged politically. And so then the question becomes, how do they actually then take their high socioeconomic status and translate that into political behavior? And that is the idea of alternative participation. Participation that can be more geared towards your identity that is not being reinforced in your actual political place. So what we see is that the suburban African Americans are more likely to protest, more likely to give to a religious organization, attend a meeting, a house meeting, and things like that. And so then the question becomes, but it's pretty clear from all the evidence that the types of stuff they're protesting, the types of meetings they're going to, are those that actually have an influence on the Black community and which they use to then actually reinforce their racial identity. All right. Next steps, don't worry too much about that. Thank you for having me. Well, not actually. Okay, so yes, real quick. So there's this 2016 and 2020 cooperative multiracial political survey. If you ever hear this guy, Matt Barretto of Lori Fraser Yoakley, it is actually the largest survey of racial and ethnic minorities in history. 3,000 African Americans, 3,000 Latinos, 3,000 Asian Americans, and 1,000 whites. And so I'm going to go back, and I actually have original questions that I put on there. And so for the next book, book number 2, is going to actually use that, and then actually go find some of these suburban African Americans and ask them more qualitatively about what they have going. Thanks.